Okay, so good morning, students. So welcome you all to another session. So let's begin today's session. So in the previous class, we have started discussing about the anatomy of the digestive system in case of humans, right? So we have been started off with the tubular part of the alimentary canal. So in previous classes, we have completed with esophagus, and then after esophagus, we moved on into the next structure, which is the stomach, right? So today, let's get into the next structure after the stomach, which is called the small intestine, and let us take up with the anatomy of the small intestine in case of humans, right? So let's begin today's session by taking up with the anatomy of the small intestine in case of humans. So talking about the small intestine. So the small intestine is actually said to be the longest part of the alimentary canal what we actually have. Right? So this is considered to be the longest part of the alimentary canal, which is said to be approximately 20 feet long, or it is said to be approximately 6 meters long. So this is the length of the alimentary canal what we actually have in case of humans. Approximately, it is said to be 20 feet long, or rather, we can take it as approximately 6 meters long. Now, this entire alimentary canal, or the entire small intestine, is divided into 3 regions, right? So there are 3 regions of the small intestine. So let us take up with those regions. The first region of the small intestine is called the duodenum. So this is the first part of the small intestine. The second part of the small intestine is called the jejunum. And the third part of the small intestine is called the ileum. Right? So these are the 3 parts of the small intestine which we have inside our system, right? So the duodenum, the jejunum, as well as the ileum. So all of these 3 parts together constitutes approximately 20 feet or 6 meters long. So let us take up the first one, the duodenum. So the duodenum of the small intestine is actually said to be an uncoiled structure. So it is said to be a straight structure. Rather than straight, we can say that it is a bent structure, a C-shaped structure which is seen right after the stomach. So the stomach opens up into the duodenum of the small intestine, and this is said to be the smallest part of the small intestine, which usually is said to be approximately 2.5 centimeters long. Right? So this is the length of the duodenum, which is said to be approximately 2.5 centimeters long. So you can just imagine, in a 20 feet long, or rather 6 meter long small intestine, how much is the first part of the small intestine duodenum? It is said to be only 2.5 centimeters long, and it is said to be a C-shaped structure, uncoiled structure, a bent structure into which the stomach actually opens up. Right? So the stomach opens into the first part of the small intestine, and is called as the duodenum. Right. Next, talking about jejunum. Jejunum is the second part of the small intestine, which is said to be approximately 8 feet long. Right, so jejunum is said to be approximately 8 feet long. So in that 20 feet long small intestine, jejunum constitutes about 8 feet of the small intestine, right? And it is said to be a highly coiled structure, right? A completely coiled, a highly coiled structure, which is said to be approximately 8 feet long. The third part, or the last part of the small intestine, is called the ileum, right? And this ileum is said to be approximately 12 feet long, right? Ileum is said to be approximately 12 feet long, and ileum is said to be the longest part of the small intestine what we have inside our system, right? And this ileum also is said to be a highly coiled structure. So 3 parts of the small intestine. Number 1, we have duodenum. Number 2, jejunum, and the ileum. Duodenum, the smallest part of the small intestine, 2.5 centimeter long. Jejunum and ileum, the longest part, right? So among these two also, the longest is said to be the ileum, which is said to be approximately 12 feet long, while the jejunum is said to be 8 feet long, right? Now these two structures, that is jejunum and ileum, they are both said to be a highly coiled structure, while the duodenum is said to be uncoiled structure. Now what exactly happens in these parts of the small intestine? Number 1, in the duodenum, there is the process of digestion actually happens. Right? So the complete digestion takes place in the duodenum. right? So this you need to remember. The complete process of digestion takes place in the duodenum. Now what happens in the jejunum and ileum? After the process of digestion, the next phase what we have in the process of digestion is the process of absorption. Right. So after the process of digestion, whatever digested food is being formed in the duodenum, so that digested food will now be sent into the ileum as jejunum as well as the ileum, where they are said to be absorbed into the blood capillaries. Right. So duodenum is the site where there is complete digestion happening. Jejunum and ileum are the sites where there is complete absorption of the digested food actually happening. Right? So this is what we have in the outer part of the duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. So let us quickly take up with the external structure. Then we get into the internal structure of the duodenum, jejunum, as well as the ileum. That is the small intestine. So we know that this is the esophagus what we have, right? So I'm just drawing it a few things here. So this is the esophagus what we have, and we know that esophagus opens up into this sac-like structure, right, which is called the stomach. And here we would actually have the diaphragm being placed, right? And then this stomach opens up into the first part of the duodenum. So we said that the part of the duodenum is actually said to be an uncoiled structure, and it is a bent structure. So it actually appears to be somewhat like this. So this is how the duodenum actually appears to be. So this part is what we call it as the duodenum. Right, the first part of the small intestine, which is called the duodenum. So the stomach opens up into the duodenum, and now this duodenum opens up into the next structure, right, which is called the jejunum as well as the ileum. So duodenum opens up into the jejunum. So for that, let me just draw the large intestine, and then we'll get into the details of that. So this is the large intestine. Right, so here we will have the large intestine coming up here, right, and here we will have this structure coming up here. Okay, so here now we will have the large intestine coming up here. So this duodenum now opens up into this particular structure here. So this would be the jejunum and ileum, which we said, which is said to be a highly coiled structure. So we cannot actually differentiate which is the jejunum as well as which is the ileum because of its highly coiled nature. So this is how it is said to be a highly coiled part. Right, so it is said to be a highly coiled structure. Right, and this structure now opens up into the large intestine here. Right, it will open up into the large intestine. So this entire structure what we have drawn here would be the large intestine, and this large intestine will now open up into this dilated structure, which we call it as the rectum, and that will open up out through the anus. Right. So here, this entire structure would give us the jejunum as well as the ileum together. So this would be jejunum and the ileum together, which is said to be a 20 feet long structure. This entire structure would be the large intestine. Now, this entire small intestine has again two openings, the anterior opening as well as the posterior opening. So this would be the anterior opening of the small intestine, where the stomach actually opens up into the duodenum. So at this opening, there is one sphincter that is actually being present here, a circular muscle. There is a sphincter being present. So we have already studied about the sphincter. So we started calling this as the pyloric sphincter. So there is this pyloric sphincter that is actually being present. So pyloric sphincter guards the stomach or the opening of the stomach as well as the duodenum. So it will prevent the backward flow of the food from the duodenum back into the stomach. So this is the anterior opening, which is guarded by the sphincter called as the pyloric sphincter. So there towards the posterior end also there is one opening that is being present, and here we would have that opening. Right, so it is the opening of the small intestine into the large intestine. And which part of the small intestine? It is the ileum part of the small intestine, which would actually open up into the large intestine. So this opening also is guarded by a valve. Right, so this opening also here is guarded by this valve. So this valve which guards this opening, we would start calling it as the ileocecal valve. Ileocecal valve. Right? We will start calling it as the ileocecal one. Ileo refers to the ileum part of the small intestine. Cecum refers to the and first part of the large intestine. So this is the cecum part, and this cecum part also has this finger-like structure which would actually arise, which we would start calling it as the vermiform appendix. So this we'll talk about little later once we get into the large intestine part. Now this opening, the opening of the small intestine to the large intestine is again guarded by a valve which is called as the ileocecal valve. Ileo refers to the ileum part of the small intestine and cecal refers to the cecum part of the large intestine where the food actually opens up or where the food actually is being transported into the large intestine through this particular valve. Again, the function of this valve is to prevent the backward flow of food, right? So ileocecal valve would prevent the backward flow of food from the large intestine back into the small intestine. So this is what we have in the external structure of the small intestine. What we have, the duodenum, which is a bent structure, a C-shaped structure, which is not said to be coiled, approximately 2.5 centimeters long, while the jejunum and the ileum, it is said to be around 20 feet long, right? And it is said to be a highly coiled structure. Two openings. Anterior opening is guarded by the sphincter called the pyloric sphincter. Posterior opening is guarded by another one, which is called as the ileocecal one. Okay, so this is the external structure what we have with regards to the small intestine part. Now let's get into the internal structure. Talking about the histology of the small intestine. Again, the same four layers are actually present even in the small intestine. Also, there is the serosa being present, there is muscularis, submucosa, and mucosa being present. So let me just quickly draw those layers so that we get a clear picture of what is happening. So this will be the outermost layer, right? And you know that outermost layer is serosa, and it is composed of these simple squamous epithelial tissue, right? So this would be the serosa part, right? Which is composed of simple squamous epithelial tissue. Now below this, there is muscularis region being present. In muscularis, we know that outer side there is this longitudinal muscles which are being present towards the outer side. So all this would be the longitudinal muscles which are present towards the outer side. And then followed by this, there are these circular muscles which are present towards the inner side. So both of these together, we will start calling it as the muscularis region, right? So we would have the serosa muscularis being present. Below the muscularis, again, there is a layer of connective tissue. We know that. So it is nothing but the areolar connective tissue or the loose connective tissue that is being present. And this loose connective tissue, we start calling this region as the submucosa, right? So this would be the submucosa. And this submucosa is now followed by the mucosal region. One characteristic feature of mucosa of this small intestine is the entire mucosa is actually thrown into folds, right? The entire mucosa is actually thrown into folds like this. So this would be the mucosal region, right? So the entire mucosa is actually said to be thrown into folds. So that is one of the characteristic features of the internal structure of the small intestine. Now each of the fold we would start calling it as the villus, or we would start calling it as the villi, which is said to be fluid. Right. Now on top of the villi, again there are cells which are being present here. Right. Again these cells are also being thrown into folds like this. Right. So these cells are also being thrown into folds. Right. So because of these folds, it gives a brush bordered appearance for this particular cells. Right. So if you just enlarge one structure, say if this is the villus what we are talking about, right? If this is the villus what we have here, right? On the villus again, there are these columnar epithelial cells which are actually said to be thrown into folds like this. Right? They are said to be thrown into folds like this. So these villi that are present on the columnar epithelial cells, right? So this villi we will start calling it as the microvilli. Right? So on the villi, there are columnar epithelial cells, and on the columnar epithelial cells, there are these microvilli being present. Because of the presence of microvilli on these cells, it gives us, or we will start calling this entire cells as the brush bordered epithelium. Start calling it as the brush bordered epithelium because it gives a brush bordered appearance because of the presence of this microvilli on the surface of the villi. Now, how many villi would be present in the small intestine? There are almost millions of villi which are actually present lining the internal walls or the internal mucosa of the small intestine. Now, we know what is the function of this villi, right? So, villi is majorly responsible for increasing the surface area for absorption. As I've already mentioned, all of the digested food would get absorbed here in the small intestine. Now, if all the digested food has to be absorbed, the surface area should be large. As a result of which, the villi mucosa is being thrown into folds, and not only that, such that the entire surface area will be increased. And not only that, on the villi, again, there are these brush bordered epithelial cells which are being present, again, which would start increasing the surface area for absorption. Right? So, this is what we have in the internal structure of this particular small intestine. So, serosa, muscularis, the submucosa and mucosa. Characteristic feature is mucosa is being thrown into folds, which is called as villi. And on the villi, there are these microvilli, which are brush bordered epithelial cells, which are present, which possess this microvilli. Right? So, this is what we have in the internal or internal structure of the small intestine. What we have now. In the mucosa and the submucosa of the small intestine, there are basically two types of glands which are being present. Right? So basically, there are two types of glands present in the mucosa as well as the submucosa also. Now let us take up with those two types of glands which are actually present. Just like how we saw gastric glands which were present in case of stomach, right? Mucosal glands which were present in case of the esophagus. So here also there are basically two types of glands which are being present. So let us try to understand those glands, where those glands are present and what are those glands and what are those secretions. Number one, the first gland is called as the crypts of labor cone. Right, so this is the first gland which is called the crypts of labor cone. Right, so this is the first gland which is called the crypts of labor cone. Now, what does this crypts of labor cone secrete? Crypts of labor cone actually secretes mucus plus the enzymes, right? It would secrete mucus as well as the enzyme. This is the first gland called the crypts of labor cone, which would secrete mucus as well as the enzyme. And this crypts of labor cone is present throughout the small intestine, right? So in all of these parts, that is the duodenum, jejunum, as well as the ileum. So in the mucosa of the small intestine, we would have the crypts of labor cone being present, right? So location, mucosa of the small intestine. So all the parts of the small intestine. So in the mucosa of all parts of the small intestine, we would have the crypts of labor cone which is present, and the major role of these crypts of labor cone is secretion of mucus as well as the enzymes. So what are these enzymes? All that we'll take up little later. What different types of enzymes which are being secreted. So this is the first gland which is called the crypts of labor cone. The second gland that is present is called the Brunner's gland. Right, it is called the Brunner's gland. So this is the second gland that is being present. So this Brunner's gland would start secreting alkaline mucus. Right, so Brunner's gland would secrete alkaline mucus. And where is this Brunner's gland actually present? Brunner's gland is present in the submucosa. Right, it is present in the submucosa of the duodenum alone. So this is one important thing what we need to remember. Location. Crypts of labor cone is present in the mucosa of all parts of the small intestine, while the Brunner's gland is actually present only in the submucosa of the duodenum. Right. And what does it secrete? It would secrete alkaline mucus. Now, what is the function of this crypts of labor cone as well as the Brunner's gland? We know crypts of labor cone secretes mucus as well as the enzymes. Enzymes are the ones which are responsible for bringing about the process of complete digestion. Right? So all the enzymes which are being secreted by the crypts of labor cone on different cells are being poured into the crypts of labor cone, and from there they move on into the duodenum where the process of complete digestion happens. Right? That is the role of the secretion of the crypts of labor cone. Second, what is the function of the secretion of the Brunner's gland? That is the alkaline mucus. So the alkaline mucus, which is being secreted by the submucosa of duodenum, it is responsible for neutralizing the acidic food which would enter into the duodenum from the stomach. We know that in the stomach the condition is a highly acidic condition. A reason why it is acidic also we are very much familiar with that because of the secretion of concentrated hydrochloric acid. Now, as the food gets partially digested in the stomach, and that partially digested food, we know it is called as the chyme. Right. So this partially digested acidic food, which is called the chyme, as it moves from the stomach into the duodenum of the small intestine, it is still acidic. So because of this acidic nature of the chyme that is entering into the duodenum, it can bring about the degradation of these walls of the or these layers of the small intestine. So to prevent that, what is the Brunner's gland doing is the Brunner's gland is secreting alkaline mucus such that the acidic chyme or the acidic food from the stomach entering into the duodenum would be neutralized upon the secretion of the alkaline mucus. So that is the role of the secretion of the Brunner's gland. Now, both of these secretions together, right, that is the secretion of crypts of Leberkuhn and Brunner's gland together, we would start giving it a name. So we would start calling it as the intestinal juice. Right, so we would start calling it as the intestinal juice, or we would start calling it as the succus entericus. Right, so either we start calling it as the intestinal juice or the succus entericus. Now, what exactly is this intestinal juice or succus entericus? It is nothing but the secretion of both the crypts of Leberkuhn as well as the Brunner's gland together. We would start calling it as the intestinal juice or the succus entericus. Now, let us get into the exact location where these two glands are actually being present. Right, the crypts of Leberkuhn as well as the Brunner's gland. So let us see where exactly they are present. So for that, what I'm doing is I'm just enlarging the structure of the mucosa and the submucosa. So here, let me just put this to be the mucosa part. Right, so this is the mucosa, and here we would have the submucosa region. So I just inverted the structure here than what we have actually seen just before. Right. Now, so this would be the mucosa region, and this would be the submucosa. Right, so this is mucosa and submucosa. So as I said, in the mucosa of the small intestine, all the region of small intestine, we would have the first one, which is called the crypts of Leberkuhn. Right, now this is one villus what we are actually talking about. So this is one villus, this is one villus, all that. Each one is said to be one villus what we are talking about. Now, this villus is lined by some cells. So there are different types of cells which are actually seen lying in the villus. So we'll see what are those cells also in a few moments from now. Right, so there are these cells which are actually lying in the villus here like this. Right, now you see the space that is present in between the cells. So this space would actually be our crypts of Leberkuhn. Right, so the empty space that you see in between the cells here, so that would be called as the crypts of Leberkuhn. Right. Now, these cells are the ones which are actually responsible for secretion of some enzymes, mucus, and all other substances. All of those secretions of these cells, they are actually poured into the crypts. And from the crypts, it would be passed on into the duodenum, where they would undergo the process of complete digestion, where they would bring about the process of complete digestion. So this is what we have with the crypts of Leberkuhn. Second gland, what we have is called the Brunner's gland. And as I've said, Brunner's gland is present in the submucosa of the duodenum alone. It is not present in the jejunum as well as the ileum part. Right. So this is the submucosa. In the submucosa, we would have the Brunner's gland actually present like this. So it is said to be a group of cells, clumped cells, which are actually present here like this. Right. So this would be the Brunner's gland. Right, so this is the Brunner's gland. Now this Brunner's gland also has a duct which would open up into the crypts of Leberkuhn, and all the secretions are actually poured into the crypts of Leberkuhn. Right, so they are actually said to be poured into the crypts of Leberkuhn. Right, so this is how the Brunner's gland is actually said to be placed. Right, so this is how these two glands are actually said to be placed. The crypts of Leberkuhn as well as the Brunner's gland together. So both of these secretions together, we will start calling it as the succus entericus. Now, as I've already said, crypts of Leberkuhn has different types of cells which are being present. So let us quickly see what are those different types of cells and what do those cells actually do. Right. So the first cells of the crypts of Leberkuhn, the first cell of the crypts of Leberkuhn So cell number 1 would be something called the goblet cells. So this is the first cell, the goblet cell. So we are very much familiar about the role of goblet cells now, right? So goblet cells is responsible for secretion of mucus. Mucus secreting cells are called as the goblet cells. So the goblet cells are actually a part of the crypts of labor, which would start secreting the mucus into the crypts of labor. So this is the first type of cell. The second type of cell is present. It is called the panic cells. Right? The panic cells. So panic cells are the ones which are responsible for the secretion of enzymes. Right? So they are responsible for secretion of enzymes. So there are different enzymes which are being secreted by the panic cells. So we'll take up with the composition of the intestinal juice all that little later. Right? So there are different types of enzymes which are being secreted. There is something called as trypsinogen. There is something called as chymotrypsinogen. Right? And sorry, not chymotrypsinogen. There are something called as enterokinase is one enzyme which is being secreted by it. Right? Along with that, there are some sort of disaccharidases which are being secreted. Right? Along with that, there is also something called as the aminopeptidases which are being secreted. All of those enzymes are being secreted by the panic cells. So composition of the intestinal juice will take up a little later once we have completely done with the anatomy part. So before we get into the mechanism of digestion, I'll just give you the composition of all of these secretions together. So panic cells are the ones which is responsible for secretion of enzymes. The third type of cells that are present, they are called argentine cells. So this also we have already spoken about argentine cells, right? It is said to be a vasoconstrictor, and it would actually secrete a vasoconstrictor, which is called as serotonin. Right? So serotonin is actually being secreted by these argentine cells, right? And it is also responsible for, as we have already said, it is responsible for bringing about the contraction, or it regulates the contraction of the muscles present in the muscularis region. Right? So serotonin is being secreted by the argentine cell. There is another cell which is called as enterochromophil cells. It is an endocrine cell, or the endocrine cells, which are called as, or which are referred to as enterochromophil cells. Enterochromophil cells. So these enterochromophil cells will start secreting a local hormone. So we'll see what is that hormone, all that little later. Right? It will start secreting a local hormone which plays a role in the process, regulating the process of digestion. Right? And there is one more cell, the last cell, which is called the basal cell. Right, so there is this basal cell which are being present, and as we have already seen when we were talking about the gastric glands, also basal cells are also involved in, or they are actually involved in, or we can put it this way, they will start acting as a precursors. Right, so they will start acting as precursors of any of the other cells. So if any of these cells are said to be damaged or if they are not functioning properly, then we would have the basal cells which would start replacing those cells that are being present. So all of these cells are actually a part of they are present in the villi, which would start giving out their secretions, and all of them would be poured into the crypts of labor, so such that they would start aiding in the process of digestion. Right? So this is what we have with the different cells that are a part of the crypts of labor. So two important glands, crypts of labor as well as the Brunner's gland. Now one more important structure, there is something called as Peyer's patch which is being present. Right? There is something called as the Peyer's patches cells which are actually being present. Right? So these Peyer's patches, they are actually said to be the lymphoid tissue. They are regarded as the lymphoid tissue, right? Very much similar to that of the tonsils, right? They are usually present in the submucosa region of the small intestine. So in the submucosa region of the small intestine, there is this lymphoid tissue which is called the Peyer's patches. And we know what is the function of this. So it is involved in bringing about the activation of the B lymphocytes. So it will start acting as a secondary lymphoid organ along with tonsils, which is involved in the process of activation of the B lymphocytes. Right. So the function of Peyer's patches is said to be very much similar to that of tonsils, what we have seen in case of the pharynx region. And that's the reason most of the cases, the Peyer's patches, they are usually referred to as the intestinal tonsils. Right? So this is one more thing what we have with regards to the small intestine part. Right? So talking about small intestine, so this is what we have in the small intestine. Three parts of the small intestine, the duodenum, jejunum, as well as the ileum. And then moving on to the internal structure, mucosa is thrown into folds which are called as villus. or villi. On the villi, there are these columnar epithelial cells which are being present. Again, these cells are also thrown into folds, which are called as microvilli, giving a brush bordered appearance. Function is it would start increasing the surface area for the process of absorption. Right? So this is what is happening. So two important glands, crypts of Leberkuhn and the Brunner's gland. So crypts of Leberkuhn would secrete mucus as well as the enzymes, while the Brunner's gland would be secreting alkaline mucus. Location is important. Crypts of Leberkuhn is present throughout all parts of the small intestine in the mucosal region, whereas the Brunner's gland is present only in the duodenum, and that too in the submucosa of the duodenum. So both of these secretions together, we would start calling it as the intestinal juice or the succus entericus. Yeah. So this is what we have with the small intestine. Duodenum is the site where complete digestion happens. Jejunum and ileum are the sites where there is complete absorption of digested food actually taking place. Right? So this is what we have with the small intestine, the anatomy of the small intestine. Right? So in the next session, let us take up with the anatomy of the large intestine, and then we'll move on into the digestive glands. Right?